It's time for our next festival edition video, and Shavuot is upon us. In the Christian tradition, we might know this as Pentecost. It's the festival of weeks in the Torah, in the Jewish tradition. Shavuot, as some may recognize it and know it. This is a holiday where we will often, the reading for this festival is the book of Ruth. And so every Shavuot, my family, we spend time reading through the book of Ruth and talking about that story. And the festival itself, like Shavuot, is a celebration of a lot of things. In the agrarian world, it was a celebration of harvest, kind of the end of the spring harvest. It's also in Jewish tradition, the celebration of the giving of Torah and the giving of law. And we've done in this same playlist, we've actually talked about that in the past. We've had a few conversations about Shavuot on that level. But the story you read is the story of Ruth. And so the Jewish assumption would be that the story of Ruth somehow embodies a lot of the things that we would be celebrating and thinking about on Shavuot. That's why the rabbis and the sages said, this is the story that you ought to read at this time of the year. And so I went to my favorite source. I went to Rabbi David Fohrman to see if he had any teachings I hadn't looked at on the book of Ruth. And in fact, he had a few that I hadn't looked at. And so I clicked on the first one that grabbed my attention, and just a 4-part course that, again, typical Rabbi Fohrman fashion, delivered on every level that you come to expect from him. So I'll try to link that teaching. I think you probably have to have a membership to view the whole course. But if you do have a membership, or if you're thinking about getting one, I'll link that teaching in the description to this video so that you can find that yourself. Because it was just phenomenal. And as always, I'm going to try not to plagiarize the entire thing. I'll just try to hint at some of the big ideas so that you can go dig in deeper with his teaching there. But he just did this great job of talking about the story of Ruth. And the story of Ruth seems pretty. It's a 4-chapter story. It's relatively short. You can read it in one night, no problem. Seems pretty obvious on the surface. You have a woman by the name of Naomi, and she's married to this Hebrew family. She's married to a Jew by the name of Elimelech, and they have 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And there's a famine in the land, and so they go to Moab. And we've talked about this as well on the BEMA Podcast. So I'll link that episode as well to give more background to what's going on in that book. I wish I would have heard this teaching from Fohrman long ago before I did the podcast episode, because man, it really changed some things for me. Not so much the teaching as a whole, but some fun little tidbits I had never seen before. But so Naomi and Elimelech and their 2 sons go to Moab during the famine, and they marry these 2 Moabite women, one by the name of Orpah and one by the name of Ruth. I believe Chilion is the one that marries Orpah, and Mahlon marries Ruth. Ruth we say, but Ruth in the Hebrew. And so they marry these 2 Moabite women, and then all the men die. Elimelech dies, Mahlon and Chilion die, and now we have these widows, these orphans, kind of left on their own. Naomi, the mom, and then Ruth and Orpah. And so Naomi tells both of them, Ruth and Orpah, you need to stay here. You shouldn't come back with me I'm going to go back to Bethlehem. I'm going to go back to Judah, but you're going to be outsiders. You're Moabites. You're not just any outsider. Like you're outsiders that really have a stigma attached to them. You don't need to come back. So Orpah stays, but Ruth insists. She refuses to stay. She insists that she goes with Naomi. So she goes back, and they end up as widows and aliens and orphans in a lot of ways, harvesting in the corner of the field. And here's the harvest, right? The celebration of Shavuot and the harvest. And it's at the right time of the year. And so they're there during the harvest, and they get so much generosity from Boaz, who happens to be one of their patriarchal ancestors, who could actually redeem them back into God's people, particularly Naomi. He could redeem her and her land, and the land that belonged to Elimelech that he probably abandoned. And so he has this, and so she sees the kindness of Boaz, and he tells Ruth, like, you need to get dressed up, you need to bathe, you need to put on wonderful clothes and perfume, and you need to go down to the threshing floor because tonight is harvest, and he's going to be partying, and he's going to be drunk, and it sounds like Naomi is setting up this seduction. And it's easy to read the story that way, like she's setting up a seduction of Boaz. And so Ruth goes down there and she's at the threshing floor and she uncovers his feet. And it's this really kind of like intimate, weird. It's kind of weird. The whole story is kind of weird. And then he agrees to marry her, and the story ends with that marriage and the genealogy of David and all. It's a pretty straightforward story. And then in typical Rabbi David Fohrman style, he says, but we've heard this story before. I love how Fohrman, like he does that with every teaching. This isn't the first time we've heard this story. We've heard this story before. Where else have we? Because the story of Ruth is really a story of what we call Levirate marriage, right? Levirate marriage, Libram in the Hebrew. Ibram, actually, I think is actually how you say it. Ibram in the Hebrew. Levirate marriage is where, in the patriarchal world, if a patriarch died without having any sons, there was nobody there to carry on his name. And so his name would just be without posterity, his name is just lost in history. And so there was a practice in that ancient Near Eastern world where you would, a brother would marry that widow and provide children. And that first boy, that first son, carries on the name of the father that's passed away. So he's not actually the son of the brother who's married in Ibram marriage. He's the brother of the deceased brother who never actually had, legally speaking, he's the brother of the deceased brother. So you have this story of Ibram, and a story of Ibram kind of being satisfied by seduction, it seems. And Fohrman says, I've heard that story before. There's actually two stories in the book of Genesis. Two stories in the book of Genesis that are stories of Ibram. And they're stories that culminate in seduction. We've heard these stories before. The first is the story of Lot and his daughters. If you know the story of Lot and his daughters, after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the daughters seduce Lot because they think that there will be no husbands for them, and the only way to keep the story going and provide ancestors is going to be to sleep with their father. Kind of an icky story. And then you have the story of Judah and Tamar at the end of the book of Genesis. It's actually the story of Joseph, and it gets interrupted. Very similar. You have the story of Abraham, and the story of Abraham gets interrupted by the story of Lot and his daughters. Like, it's just this weird, it has nothing to do with the story of Abraham. It's this weird story. In the same way, you have the story of Joseph, but then like right in the middle, the story gets interrupted by the story of Judah and Tamar. There are all these similarities. The story of Judah and Tamar is a story of Ibram. Judah had a son who married a woman by the name of Tamar, and he dies without having any kids. And so Judah gives his next son to Tamar, but he doesn't want to produce children with her. And so God, we're told in the story, Genesis 38, kills him. And so there's now a third son, but Judah doesn't want to give the third son. He doesn't want to lose all of his sons to this daughter, Tamar. So he refuses to do the act of justice. He robs her of this act of justice. And so she then seduces, seeing that she's not going to be treated justly. She seduces, she takes matters into her own hands, just like Lot's daughters. And she seduces Judah, into sleeping with her. Both stories of Ibram, both stories of seduction to solve the problem, and yet both kind of tragedies. So it feels like Ruth is kind of retelling these tragic tales, a story of Ibram and seduction. Like, it feels kind of like, why would you want to retell those stories? And so Fohrman, and you've got to go back and listen to the whole teaching, but Fohrman goes back and he examines these two stories. He says we need to understand these earlier stories if we're ever going to understand the story of Ruth. And so he goes back to the story of Lot, and he talks about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot's behavior. And Lot is willing to save these angelic guests that are there to visit. If you remember, the angels are there, and He's showing them hospitality and he's protecting them from the angry mob that's outside. But then he's willing to give up his daughters, right? So that's kind of like, ugh. So Lot's willing to give up his daughters, but he's going to protect the outsider. And as Fohrman put it, it's a story that was about kindness, but not built on the foundation of recognition, right? He's willing to show kindness to the outsider, but he's not willing to recognize the place of even his own family. So there's no recognition, there's only kindness. It's really not even kindness, it's false kindness, it's broken kindness, it's a kindness that's centered on himself. It really isn't a kindness that exists because he sees other people. It's a pseudo kindness, it's a broken kindness that's aimed at me. I want to protect me in the Lot story. And so it leads to tragedy. On the other hand, we have the Judah story, where there's recognition, and that word is actually used in the Judah story repeatedly, that idea of recognize. There's recognition. He recognizes at the end of the story that he was wrong and Tamar was right. There's this beautiful story of his ability to confess. It actually sets up the restoration of the entire rest of the story. We'll end up saving the family. It's the key to the story of Joseph. We've talked about that before. But it's a story of recognition. But then we're told at the end of the story that he never takes care of Tamar. He doesn't sleep with her again, obviously. But he also doesn't show her any kindness. So the first story is about kindness, but no recognition. No recognition, no justice. The second story is a story of justice, of recognition, but no kindness. And those two things fall apart. In the story of Ruth, what you end up getting is a convergence of both. So the story is supposed to connect us to both of those two earlier stories, because the story is marrying those two stories. And that's a pun, because they will literally get married. Who is Ruth a descendant of? Moab. But Moab is the descendant of Lot, the direct descendant of Lot. Like the child of the Lot story is Moab, and the descendant of Moab is Ruth. But the descendant of the Judah story is Perez, and his descendant, the seventh descendant of Judah, the seventh descendant is Boaz. So you literally have both stories, the Lot story and the Judah story, finding a literal marriage together. But in Ruth chapter 2, in the book of Ruth is like those two ideas of recognition and kindness literally come together as she's talking to Boaz. She says, "Why would you recognize me?" And he says, remember, he's the descendant of the recognition story. He's the descendant of Judah, the recognizer, right? And she says, "Why do you recognize me?" She's the descendant of the kindness story. And so what does Boaz say? He says, "I've heard about your kindness." These two things are literally flooding the Ruth story. And so when you get to chapter 3, what seems like a seduction story, it's the setup for a seduction story, but instead of seduction, the stories redeem themselves because both characters, Ruth and Boaz, do the thing that their ancestors weren't willing to do. Ruth is a person of kindness, but chooses to show recognition. She calls, she confronts, she demands. She is a chutzpah-laden woman. She has some guts. She stands up to Boaz. And instead of taking advantage of him for her own benefit, she's not just going to show kindness for her own benefit. She's going to call him. She's going to say, "You need to do the right thing." So she recognizes and shows kindness. Judah recognizes and then says yes to the opportunity to show kindness. It is this brilliant, beautiful connection of both stories being redeemed in the story of two people willing to overcome the mistakes of their ancestors. And that is a fantastic story. And so Fohrman suggests that actually one of the things that we're supposed to remember at Shavuot when we think about the giving of the law and we're celebrating Torah and the way of God and the Bible and all those kinds of things, one of the things that we ought to remember is that if you remove either of those things, a true obedient walk, the walk of righteousness, zedekah, righteousness is the Hebrew word is zedekah. Righteousness looks like a marriage of kindness and recognition. It's not a selfish kindness that doesn't recognize the other person. And it's not just a recognition without showing the kindness. It is a marriage of both seeing the other person and reaching out with a generous chesed, a generous kindness, a generous, loving. That is good stuff. I loved it. I loved learning about that this year as I got ready for Shavuot. So I pass that on to you. I hope it's a fun learning experience. Go check out, if you've got a membership, if you're able, go check out that teaching from Rabbi Fohrman. Get the whole thing. It's 4 videos. It's probably less than 40 minutes. It's probably close to 40, about 10 minutes every video. 4 videos, 4 10-minute videos. You can check out that course and have just an incredible time watching there are so many parallels between this story and 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 this. They're all over the place. So deliberate by the author of Ruth. Love me some Bible learning. Anyway, I hope that's great. I hope it's a wonderful, encouraging message. Something to think on, something to chew on as we pass through this Shavuot season. So there you go. Until the next time, the next festival, the next opportunity to feast and to celebrate and to reflect. We'll talk to you then.